My name is Hannah Whitmore, and I'm 29 years old. 3 days before my wedding, I found out my own parents had been telling my fiancé something I never expected to hear about myself, that I'd abandoned a child years ago and left her to be raised by strangers. It wasn't true, not the way they told it, but by the time I learned what they'd said, the damage was already sitting in my fiancé's eyes every time he looked at me. What none of them knew was that the truth was about to walk through the door herself at our own rehearsal dinner. The private room at the restaurant was warm with candlelight, the kind of soft golden glow you'd want for a night like this, glasses of wine catching the light as everyone settled in for the toasts before tomorrow's ceremony. I was laughing at something my future sister-in-law had said, when I noticed my father lean toward my fiancé, Jason, murmuring something low near his ear, my mother nodding along beside him, with that tight, purposeful expression she wore whenever she thought she was doing something important. Jason excused himself politely, following my parents just outside the private room, and I assumed it was nothing, some last-minute detail about the seating chart or the toast order. But when he walked back in 8 minutes later, he wasn't the same man who'd left. His jaw was tight, his eyes carefully avoiding mine, and when he sat back down beside me, he left an inch more space between us than there had been before. To understand why my parents would say something so devastating 3 days before my wedding, you have to understand the story they'd been quietly rewriting for over a decade. When I was 19, my younger sister Claire got pregnant during her first year of college, a relationship that ended before the baby was even born. My parents, terrified of what people in our small town would say about a teenage pregnancy in the family, made a decision without ever really asking either of us how we felt about it. They decided the story would be that the baby, a girl named Lily, was mine. I was older. I'd just graduated. It was, in their minds, a smaller scandal to manage, a single unwed daughter rather than two, and it kept Claire's college scholarship and reputation intact. I went along with it at first because I was young and scared, and because saying no to my parents had never once worked out well for me. What I never agreed to was staying in that lie forever. When Claire married years later and quietly took Lily to raise as her own daughter with her new husband, I thought the story had finally ended. I didn't realize my parents had kept the original version alive in their own minds, twisting my quiet decision to protect my sister into something they now needed my fiancé to believe, especially once they realized wedding planning meant losing whatever control over my life they still had left. Dinner continued, but something in the room had shifted, subtle enough that a stranger wouldn't have noticed, obvious enough that I felt it in my chest with every course that came out. Jason answered my questions in shorter sentences now, his hand no longer finding mine under the table the way it usually did. When my aunt asked him how he was feeling about tomorrow, he gave a polite, careful answer that avoided looking directly at me while he said it. I caught my mother watching us from across the table, something satisfied flickering behind her otherwise composed expression, and I understood in that moment that whatever she'd said to Jason, she considered it a success. My father refilled his wine and avoided my eyes entirely, which told me even more than my mother's expression did. He'd always been the one who felt guiltiest about the lie, and guilt on my father usually looked exactly like silence. 2 of my cousins were whispering near the dessert table, glancing over every few seconds in that particular way people do when they think they're being subtle. I ran through every possible explanation in my head, wondering what version of the story my parents had chosen to tell, knowing it was likely some warped fragment of the truth, twisted just enough to make me the villain. I wanted to stand up, to ask Jason directly what my parents had said, but some old practice instinct told me to wait, to stay calm, to not hand this family the scene they seemed to be quietly hoping for. What none of them understood, sitting there whispering behind their wine glasses, was how much I had actually given up to protect a decision that was never mine to begin with. Lily wasn't my abandoned daughter. She was my niece, Claire's daughter, a little girl I had held in a hospital room 3 days after she was born, a little girl I had driven 2 hours to visit every single month for the first 4 years of her life, while my parents insisted, quietly and constantly, that I keep my distance so the story could stay consistent. I remembered the ache of standing in doorways at family gatherings, watching Claire get to be introduced as Lily's aunt while I stood there absorbing quiet judgment from relatives who believed I was the mother who couldn't be bothered. I remembered biting back the truth at Christmas dinners, at birthday parties, at the hospital the day Lily broke her arm, because unraveling the lie meant exposing Claire's teenage pregnancy to a family that had spent over a decade being told a leaner, more convenient version of events. I'd made peace with the silence years ago, not because it was fair, but because Claire had built an entire life around that quiet arrangement. A husband who believed Lily was his stepdaughter from a previous relationship of Claire's, a stable home. A story that let a 14-year-old girl grow up without the complication of teenage pregnancy gossip following her through school. I had decided, over and over again, that my own discomfort was a small enough price to keep that stability intact. What I hadn't accounted for was my parents deciding, 3 days before my wedding, that my old silence was worth sacrificing for one final act of control. Jason waited until the dessert plates had been cleared, leaning close enough that only I could hear him, his voice low but unmistakably strained. "Your parents told me something tonight," he said, "and I need you to tell me if it's true. They said you had a daughter years ago and that you gave her up, left her with strangers, and never told me." I felt my pulse pick up, not from guilt, but from 13 years of practiced restraint suddenly straining against a lie I hadn't chosen and desperately wanted to correct. I could see the fear underneath his careful composure, the fear that he was marrying someone who'd hidden something enormous from him. I reached over and took his hand, steady despite everything happening beneath the surface. "I need you to trust me for 5 more minutes," I said quietly. "I promise you, everything they told you is wrong, but the reason it's wrong isn't something I can explain quickly, and it isn't only my story to tell right this second." Jason studied my face for a long moment, searching for the deception my parents had planted in his mind. And just as he opened his mouth to press further, the private room door opened. A girl of about 13 walked in first, dark hair pulled back the same way Claire always wore hers at that age, scanning the room until her eyes landed on me and lit up with easy, unguarded delight. "Aunt Hannah!" she called out, hurrying across the room, the way only a child who feels completely safe with someone would, wrapping her arms around me before I'd even fully stood up. "Lily," I said, laughing despite everything, holding her tightly for a moment before pulling back to look at her. "You weren't supposed to be here until tomorrow." "Mom said we could come early since the rehearsal ran late," she said, then turned, suddenly aware of Jason's confused expression. "Oh, sorry, I'm Lily, Aunt Hannah's niece." The room went utterly silent. Claire walked in a few steps behind her daughter, immediately reading the tension thick enough to touch, her eyes flicking from my face to our parents' pale, frozen expressions, understanding instantly what had happened without needing a single word explained. "Niece?" Jason repeated slowly, turning first to me, then to my parents, who suddenly seemed very interested in their empty dessert plates. "Yes," Claire said, stepping forward, her voice steady despite the color draining from her own face. "Lily is my daughter. She's always been my daughter. Hannah has been the best aunt any child could ask for. And I have no idea what story you were told tonight, but I promise you, whatever it wasn't true." My mother's fork clattered softly against her plate. My father wouldn't meet anyone's eyes at all. And for the first time in over a decade, the version of events I'd protected with my own silence was finally, unmistakably, standing in the open. My mother's composure cracked completely now, her hands twisting the napkin in her lap as every relative at that table turned toward her, waiting for an explanation that wasn't coming easily. "We were only trying to protect this family," she said, her voice thin, reaching for the same justification she'd used for 13 years. "You weren't protecting anyone," I said, my voice calm but no longer careful, no longer softened for their comfort. "You made a decision when I was 19 and let me carry the weight of it for over a decade. And when you realized my wedding meant losing control over that story, you tried to burn my relationship down rather than let the truth exist on its own." My father finally looked up, his eyes glassy, guilt written plainly across his face, though he still said nothing. Claire reached over and squeezed my hand under the table, a silent apology for a decision that had never truly been mine to make in the first place. "I stayed quiet for 13 years to protect Claire and Lily," I said, looking directly at my parents now. "I'm done protecting a lie that was only ever meant to protect the two of you." Jason exhaled slowly beside me, some of the tension finally leaving his shoulders as understanding settled fully into place. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, just to me. "I should have waited to hear it from you instead of believing them first." "You didn't know what you didn't know," I said, and meant it, feeling something loosen in my own chest as well. 13 years of carefully managed silence finally releasing its grip. Lily climbed into the chair beside Claire, already chattering about the wedding cake, blissfully unaware of the storm that had just passed through the room around her. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt entirely unafraid of what my parents thought, of what story they might try to tell next. Whatever control they'd held over my life through that old careful lie had finally, completely run out. Lying in bed that night, wedding dress hanging in the closet just a few feet away, I understood something I wish I'd known at 19. Silence given to protect someone you love is not the same as a lie told to control you. I had given 13 years to the first. I would give my parents none more for the second. If your own family has ever rewritten your story to keep you smaller, more manageable, easier to control, you already know how it feels the moment the truth finally stands up on its own and speaks for itself.